Don't even ask me to try to do an Arnold impression. It's not going to be pretty. Hey, I'm Amy and welcome back. Today I am checking off the last movie from 1990 off the list, at least for this year. I probably will do this again for my birthday next year, but that might be the end of it. I think there's only 2 or 3 1990 movies left on the list. So, with that being said, let's talk about Total Recall. I'm not usually a huge fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger-y action movies. He just doesn't do it for me. I don't think he's a great actor, but I do love a good sci-fi action movie like Blade Runner or Alien/Aliens. So I figured I probably would have a really great time with this movie, and I was not wrong. And before I dig into the meat and potatoes of this video, as usual, let's start with a quick summary of the movie. Doug Quaid, a hulking regular Joe, has recurring dreams about Mars, but when they are dismissed by his wife, he goes to visit a company that will manufacture him a dream vacation to the Red Planet. When he wakes up, Quaid finds himself pursued by various hitmen, both mutant and human. It's up to him to figure out what is fact and what is fiction. While I was watching Total Recall, it gave me the feeling like I was watching Blade Runner again, and I thought at the moment that it was mostly because it was a 90s/80s era sci-fi movie with some action in it, and they both kind of were similar in a way. In Blade Runner, he's looking for these androids, and in Total Recall, he is kind of the same thing. He's like a secret agent versus a policeman type thing, so if that makes any sense. So I kind of wrote it off as that, but once I started really digging into reading about this movie in the 1001 book and doing a little bit of research, and I think they say something about this at the very beginning of the movie during the opening credits. But Total Recall is based on a Philip K. Dick novel, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, just like Blade Runner was based on a Philip K. Dick novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And as I was going even further into researching and analyzing this movie, I found that they both are very similar, more than I had even thought. Granted, they have very different directors and very different looks and feels to them. Their themes go on very similar paths, stemming from Philip K. Dick's writing. The similar themes that they explore are identity, perception, and real versus fake memories. And they both end in the same ambiguous way, leaving it up to the audience to decide what happens after the credits roll. As I mentioned earlier, I really love sci-fi, so watching this, it was a huge blast, and I'm also a huge fan of the 90s, if you hadn't realized from the last couple videos. So this movie was just pure 90s nostalgia for me. Everything just looked so 90s and felt very 90s, and I love the fact that it was a futuristic movie, but with the late 80s, early 90s perception of what technology would look like in the future. Everyone was still wearing very 80s/90s outfits, and all of the technology was the big clunky computers of early 90s eras. Almost the most futuristic thing about this movie was the fact that people were living on Mars. Not even the fact that they could implant memories into people, which is very futuristic, but the equipment that they used to do that still looks so incredibly 90s and retro, at least compared to the technology that we see in future movies, or movies about the future today. And speaking of the very 90s look of this movie, the sound effects and all the effects in general just felt very 90s to me. I mean, anytime somebody hit somebody else with a sword or a gun, or like at one point Arnold knocked this guy across the face and left this huge cut with his hand, and it was great effects. The blood, there's so much blood. It was so much bloodier than I thought it would be. Not gonna lie, I was kind of in the mood for some fun, over-the-top sci-fi action when I watched this movie. I just loved the sound effects, and when he turns the TV off at one point, it just makes this really loud turning off noise. And at one point, I kind of laughed out loud when this happened. The airport When they're entering into Mars, one of the windows gets blown out and all the air starts sucking out, and one of the cops like grabs onto this pole so he doesn't fly away, and his hand hitting the pole makes this really loud sound effect, and I just found it kind of funny because it didn't even sound like what your hand would sound like when it hits a metal pole. It sounded like this. And some of the effects in this, although granted they were in the 90s, but they are just amazing 90s graphics and effects. Like anytime someone is outside on Mars, there is some great eye bulging effects that I really loved. And the effects for when Schwarzenegger is pulling the tracker out of his head, and when Cueto is kind of coming out of his brother or whatever, that whole thing is, I loved the makeup and effects for this because it looked so fake, but at the same time it just was kind of gory and gross, which I think is what they were going for, but at the same time was so awesome. It's just pure 90s and it's the best. I keep rambling about that. I need to get more vocabulary. I need to get a better vocabulary. I'm all over the place today. All of the 90s nostalgia and effects aside, this movie is very well written. It has a nice, tight, and concise script, and it lays little hints out for you to find as the movie goes on that aren't super obvious. Like today, if the filmmaker wants you to remember something for the future, they will do an intense zoom up on it or very heavily point it out. In this, they kind of just let it go. It's in the background for you to kind of think about, not even notice at points. There was one thing that was kind of heavily pointed out, but it took a while for it to build up. And I wrote in my notes, I think it was almost an hour before the holographic mimic thing actually came into play. They show him finding it and testing it, but then they show him actually using it towards the end. I was like, oh, they're definitely going to be using that. But as the movie was getting closer to the end of the third act, I was like, maybe they're not going to be using that. Maybe it was just kind of throwing it in there for something that you think they're going to be pointing out and using it for later, but they're not. But they ended up doing it, which I kind of like that they were maybe going to throw you for a loop with that. Things like when Quaid first goes through the x-ray sensors at the subway station, and you hear over the loudspeakers them saying this.
You are now entering a safety zone. No unauthorized weapons allowed beyond this point.
And then later on, he is trying to escape from these hitmen, and he runs through the subway and he has the gun he stole from his wife, and you see it in there, and then all the alarms go off.
Get him! He's got a gun! Cut him off that way! Over there! Hold it! He's over there!
And you instantly think, oh, I remember, he's not supposed to have guns or weapons in here, because I remember hearing that a couple minutes ago over the loudspeaker, and it was just kind of a background thought. You didn't really think about it. One other thing that I thought was kind of going to come into play is Saturn. He talks to his wife in the beginning about the Mars dream, and she suggests that instead of them moving to Mars or taking a trip to Mars, they just take a vacation to Saturn instead. And then when he goes to recall to get a Mars memory implanted into him, they're like, oh, why don't you just go to Saturn instead of Mars? Everyone wants to go to Saturn. So I thought that Saturn would kind of play a bigger role in this, which it didn't, and I'm okay with that. Like I said with the holographic mimic part, I thought that it would be something that they were gonna throw in there and make kind of a deal about and then use it later on in the movie, but with this, they just threw it in there. It was just kind of a little sly joke, and they didn't really talk about it again. Overall, I was so pleasantly surprised by this movie. I mean, at points, even though I thought it was very well written and very concise, it got predictable a little bit. Like, at one point I knew that taxi driver guy was maybe going to be a little bit of a villain or helping the other side when they bring him in to see Cueto. So that was a little bit predictable, but honestly, a lot of sci-fi movies can be predictable like that. So I won't fault it for that, but it is really one of the better written sci-fi movies that I've seen in a while, since maybe like Aliens. Well, I don't know. Quiet Place was really well written. I guess for a 90s movie, it was very well written, and honestly, it's probably one of my new top 5 favorite sci-fi movies. I really wish I had seen it before now. And onto the clip for this movie. I couldn't find a quote iconic clip for this movie, but as soon as I saw this one, I burst out laughing and knew it had to be the clip I used for this video.
You think this is the real Quaid? It is.
And that is all I have for Total Recall. As always, these are just my opinions, but I would love to know yours in the comments down below. What are your favorite sci-fi movies? They can be from any year, any era. If you want to know which films I have watched or just follow my progress in general, there's a link to a Google Doc in the description down below with all of the films I have watched so far. After watching Pretty Woman for the last video, I thought it would be a good idea to watch the movie that kind of inspired it, or was basically the Pretty Woman of the 60s, My Fair Lady, starring the incomparable Audrey Hepburn. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really truly do appreciate every single one of you. Let me know who you are in the comments down below and let's be friends. If you enjoyed this, leave a like and subscribe if you're new, because I love talking movies, TV shows, filmmaking, and film history, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!